All right, we are going to cover the Autodesk Fusion 360 user interface, or UI. This is just a short video to kind of get you familiar with how to use things, where to find tools, what to look for as you're working through using Fusion 360. Have Fusion 360 open, and let's just start to go through this. So if you follow my mouse, I'm just going to come up here. The data panel, super important. This is where you store your files. Fusion 360 is cloud-based. One of the benefits of that is you can move to a different computer, open Fusion 360, and all of your files are there for you to have access to. So if you click on the data panel, those little squares, it brings up all of the different things that you can do. Not necessarily things you can do, but projects that you've made. And you can also share files with others as well. I can go home. You can organize things in folders here. These are all my lovely things. There's these assets here. There's some basic training things beyond the tutorials that I'm doing. So they're all found in the data panel. If you want to open something that you've already created, you just simply find it in the folder and then double click on it and it opens up into Fusion. This does take up a lot of space, so usually I keep it minimized. Simply minimize it. All you have to do is click that button again and it disappears. Next to it is your typical file menu. This is where you save things. You can open a new design from here. You can export stuff in different ways to different things. A quick save icon next to that. And then very important for anybody who's ever done any drawing in a CAD program, the undo and redo buttons. They're always right up here at the top. Undo is Control Z, by the way. That's pretty universal. So that's another quick little tip there. So that's that. Across the top here, you can see you can have tabs. You can simply click just like you would in a browser, you can open up a new tab, and you can have multiple tabs open inside Fusion 360. Any extensions you add are over here. Job status, that's if you are using the Fusion 360 cloud to do any data processing, things like finite element analysis, that would happen here. This indicates who's logged in. If you click on that, you have access to your preferences and to change your profile settings. Preferences is where you would set any specific things to how you want Fusion 360 to work for you. And these transfer. The other nice thing about these is they transfer. Anytime you open the program, they automatically read your preferences the last time you set them up. So you can go crazy about like the color of things, how you want Fusion 360 to color different things within it. In general, the pan, zoom, orbit, if you're used to SolidWorks, you can go in and you can change it to SolidWorks. You can change it to Inventor. I'm leaving it in Fusion, assuming that most of you haven't used the Fusion interface before, so that I can talk about how to use that. So I'm going to click cancel out of that. So that's all that. Okay, moving along. Back over here to the top left, you'll see there's a big block that says design. If you click on that, you'll see that there's different functions that Fusion 360 can serve. So the first one is design. This is where we'll be spending almost all of our time, at least in the initial Fusion 360 tutorials will just be in the design workspace. There is a generative design workspace where you can set constraints, and Fusion 360 will essentially design your part for you. As designers, that's not really the outcome we want, but if you're engineering and you're trying to engineer a solution, you can kind of see the little pop-up here where they have a typical caster on the left, and then on the right they have the generatively designed caster, which would be lighter weight and use less material and be just as strong. It is kind of cool that this is built in, and this is actually pretty new inside Fusion. I actually don't have a lot of experience playing around with that. There is a render engine built in. This is where you would do photorealistic rendering. This is a way to make your the thing that you're working on look like it's not just existing inside a computer, but you can give it some real life constraints. You can obviously apply different materials to different parts of your design so that things are metal or wood. They can become reflective. You can choose lots of different types of wood to give it a more realistic look, and then you can essentially take a photograph of it and people think that you've actually made the thing and not knowing that it just exists only inside Fusion. There's an animation engine here which allows you to actually apply motion to things. You can interlock components and give them what Fusion360 calls joints that essentially constrains how different objects move in relationship to one another. And then you can apply motors to those joints and actually create those joints to spin around. Or you can add springs and they have a spring-like motion, all of that different stuff. And then you can take a video of that and send it to somebody to share how your design actually functions. So obviously that can be very useful. The next one down is simulation. For any engineers listening, this would be where we would find our finite element analysis. Essentially what it does is it takes your design, you can give it some constraints and apply certain loading conditions, and it will tell you where the areas of maximum stress are. It also does things like heat and shows you how heat might flow through a part, or flow analysis from the perspective of like water or a fluid flowing through pipes. It will start to do an analysis on how those things work. So it is pretty powerful engineering tool, not just a powerful design tool. Next tab down is manufacturing. There is actually a CNC toolpath creator built into Fusion360. This is really nice. You don't have to move to a third-party software. So if you want to use like the Tormach CNC mill down in Wilbur, or the CNC router in the shop, the wood shop in Mountaintop, this is how you could use it. You could create your part in Fusion360, switch over to the manufacture tab, and you can tell it what to do and how to actually cut through different parts and that sort of thing. So again, very, very powerful. The last tab down here is drawing. This allows you to create a 2D drawing, top, front, side view in about 6 seconds from a design that you've done. It's a great way of sharing kind of a traditional output, if you will, in a 2D format. So we still do that sometimes. And if you watch the next couple tutorials, you'll see I start in the beginning with a PDF drawing that I did right inside Fusion of the part that we're drawing, so that you can see it from multiple views, and you can also see the dimensions. So that's all here in that menu. As we change through these, the toolbar or the tool ribbon here, so I'm going to go back to design, they will change depending on what mode you're in. So if I switch to generative design, you'll see that those tools change. And if I change to like the render engine, that tool ribbon will change yet again. So you have different tool sets depending on what mode you're in. Again, for most of what we're working on, we will be sitting inside the design mode. Once we're inside the design mode, there's several tabs across the top. Solid modeling, surface modeling, which allows us to just work on the outside surfaces. We won't be spending a lot of time in here, at least in the early tutorial videos. There's a sheet metal interface where you can essentially unbend 3D geometry, and it helps you figure out, you know, like how much tolerance you need to add into the thickness based on the thickness of the metal. And there's other tools that you can like send stuff to 3D printers, or you can do inspections to see how things can actually be routed, and if you have undercuts that would be difficult to route. But again, we're going to be staying inside this solid tab. Once we're there, the first set of tools we'll use are these create tools. This allows us to actually make stuff. These are just the most used tools across the top. Underneath that, if you click the create button, you'll see there's additional tools below. Similar to the modify, standard modify tools are here. Below that, there's a lot of other modify tools we can add. Assemble, this is when we have multiple parts when we're bringing together them. We can start to create joints between them. We can tell different components how to interact with each other. So this is all the assemble steps. Construct we will use This is essentially geometry that only exists so that you can build other geometry. So we can create new planes, we can create axes, we can create points in different places that we can reference in as we work through sketches or other geometries. Inspect, the default tool here is the measure tool, really convenient to be able to measure between 2 points and see how long it is. There are a few other things here as well. You can, like center of mass, that can be sometimes very, very helpful. And you can also get like area inside your component, so you get a sense of area or volume as well. Insert, we'll use this in a later tutorial as well, where we're bringing in a drawing that we can use as a reference. And then the selection set, if you're trying to select just a face or just a body, you can actually choose how Fusion 360 defaults when it selects different things. And that's here under selection priority. So if you keep trying to grab a face and you keep getting the whole body, you can actually say, oh, select the face as the priority. These things will probably become more apparent as you start to work through Fusion. On the left here, going back to the main screen, is our browser. This will change as we add components. So every drawing that we start inside Fusion 360 will have a few basic things. Right now this is unsafe, so it has no title. You can turn on and off objects here using the little eye. And then underneath each object, it's going to have its own series of different components. So first one is document settings. So I'm defaulted to millimeters. You can always change what unit you're drawing in by clicking the arrow to expand this, and then click the little icon where it says change active units. It pops up a little window over here where you can select to move to inches if you're more comfortable in inches, or feet. Again, for our first couple tutorials, we'll be in the millimeter phase, so I'm going to leave it there. Click cancel to escape out of there. Named views, so top, front, and right side. These are pretty generic ones. And the home view, which is an isometric view, which is where kind of Fusion 360 defaults. So you kind of see that the axis is tilted. We're seeing the XY plane here sort of tilted off, and so we can see X, Y, and Z. That is our home view, but we can click through the top view and it'll show us a top view of something. We can click through the front view, it'll show the front view of something. Right view, it'll show the right view, or back to home. You can also get to these same views by using the view cube up in the right, which is a very, very helpful tool. I'll show you that in a second when we move to actual specific geometry to look at. And then the other default thing that you have is the origin points. So this is the actual origin right here in the middle. This is very important, and I'll talk about this in future tutorials about how we have to be tied into the origin to be fully constrained. X-axis, Y-axis, Z-axis, XY plane, XZ plane, YZ plane. So those are all the defaults. We can add additional points, additional axes, and additional planes using the construct command, but we start out with these default ones as we begin. Down across the bottom is our timeline. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then you have a few tools here at the bottom. You have a constrained orbit tool. So if you can click on this at any point, even if you're in the middle of a command, to orbit something so you can see it. There's also some great shortcuts with the mouse, which I'll cover in just a second. You can look at, so I can click look at and then click a surface, and it will make that normal to my monitor surface. Pan, which allows me to move things across the screen. A zoom to fit, that puts everything that you've drawn inside the available viewport of your window here. Display settings, this allows you to change how you're looking at an object and maybe what environment you're working in. So I'm stuck in this photo booth here. I think that's easiest for you to see as I'm going through tutorials, but if you're drawing a lot, the Tranquility Blue is really nice. It doesn't hurt your eyes quite as much. It's not quite as bright. If you like to draw in dark, the gray sky actually is quite nice as well. So this is really up to user preference. That's all here. Effects, you can turn things on and off. Like right now I have the ground plane on. You can turn that off if you don't want it. You can add a shadow so that your object looks like it's kind of floating. Object visibility, you can again, you can see all the things that you can turn on or off. The camera, it's giving you a perspective view right now. You can switch to orthographic, which won't make it go back. And so like right now, if you look at my grid, the grid squares back here are pretty small. The grid squares are up here are pretty big. That's because I'm showing in perspective. So things closer to me are larger, things further away are smaller. The lines aren't necessarily parallel to each other. They're all going back to a vanishing point. If I switch to an orthographic mode, you'll notice that all of my squares are identical in scale now. My whole grid kind of shifts. Again, some of this is user preference. Some of this is also depending on what you're working on. I typically draw in the perspective mode because I think it's easier to see things. We can control our grid here with the next tab over. Just you can add a snap to grid, which I would leave off. And if I don't know if it's defaulted on or not, but I would turn that off. Otherwise, your mouse sort of skips between each of these grid points. You can set what those grid points are by the incremental move and set increments here. And lastly, viewports. Again, this is a user preference thing. I opt for one viewport and just sort of rotating through the views. Some people like to draw on multiple views. So if I switch to multiple views, you actually see you get a top, a front, a side, and an isometric view kind of all at the same time as you're working. I don't think that's really super helpful, especially early on. I would switch to the single view. All right, so how do these things change as we draw? So I'm going to switch over to this goofy little thing I drew quickly here. I'm calling it the Eye of Sauron. This was literally like a 12-second drawing just so I had some geometry to share with you. So you'll notice when I switch over to this, my browser changes. Now, in addition to Origin, I have bodies, sketches, and construction. I had to add a couple planes when I was drawing, so those are here. And if you float over them, it will actually show you where those are. Sketches, it will show me the different sketches. Again, if I highlight over this started with just a rectangle. And then there was another sketch which has that hole that goes through the middle of this thing here. Those you can see are defaulted to be turned off. I can turn those on and it will stay on. I can turn it off and it will turn off. Bodies, it's all one body right now because I'm joining as I'm going, so I don't have individual bodies. And I can turn that body on or off as well here. Okay, going down to the timeline, you'll see this looks very different than it did when I just had nothing on the screen, nothing in the timeline. Here I have a full timeline. And so this actually allows me to go back in time, and you can kind of see exactly how I built this thing by working through this timeline. And as you add things, you get this new icon, and that all changes exactly how things happen. So right now I just have this one sketch. If I wanted to go in and I right-click on top of that, and I can click Edit Sketch, and it allows me to go back in and actually modify that sketch if I want to. I can change dimensions of things, clean it up. I can change the overall geometry. And hopefully, if I don't mess anything up, then I can just work back through my timeline to add in all those extra features. So there's my sketch. I've extruded that sketch, and I've actually extruded it at an angle. I've added a sphere on top. I then added a new sketch, which is a circle at the bottom that I extrude through to make that hole. Then I add a new plane, which is that plane there, so that I can draw this torus that I use to cut out that geometry. And then I add another plane through that section, which I then draw another torus on to cut out that geometry. So pretty simple and basic, but that's my timeline, and I can just sort of work back through. At any stage, I can click on top of one of these icons and click Edit Feature. I could even click Edit Profile Sketch and go kind of back in time and modify the things that I did moving forward. Right? I'm going to click Cancel there. OK, so that is the timeline. Let's talk really quickly about using your mouse to kind of control what you're looking at. When I'm defaulted inside Fusion, my scroll wheel is your best friend. So if I just use the scroll wheel, I can zoom in or out. I can zoom way in on something. I can zoom way out. But if I want to see that hole that's kind of tucked behind here, it's hard for me to do that. Now, I could go up to my view cube and be like, let's look at a top view of this thing. And that'll actually show me, like from the top down, what this thing looks like. Now this is rotated 90 degrees, so I'm going to go back up to my view cube and rotate it around, so I'm actually seeing it the way I want it to. But it doesn't really give me full control to kind of like orbit around this thing. I could click here, this arrow, go to free orbit, and that's going to allow me to orbit this way. That's a lot of clicks. I know it doesn't seem that way, but it's a lot of clicks. I just hit escape. The other thing you can do is if you hold down the shift key on your keyboard and hold down the scroll wheel, that allows you to free orbit. That defaults to free orbit. So I can orbit this thing around that way. I can let go of the shift. I can zoom in or out. If you just hold down the scroll wheel without shift, this allows you to pan around. So if it's like, oh, I want to see what's going on at the bottom of this, I'm going to zoom in here. I want to see what's going on up. Now I need to orbit it, hold down that shift and the scroll wheel. I can kind of look at these at a certain detail. So that really helps me sort of navigate through the screen. Again, scroll wheel without any modifiers, just moving in and out is my zoom. Hold down the scroll wheel without any modifiers, that's my pan. And hold down the scroll wheel and the shift key, and that allows me to orbit. Okay. If I want to go back to one of those default views, again, my view cube is right here. I can click back. I can, if I want to kick the front, I can hit this little arrow over here to, the left side, click it again. There's my front side. If I want to see the top, I can click there. If I want to see the bottom, I can click there. Or if I want to go back to that orthographic, I click that home icon there, and that's going to send me back to the orthographic projection. So I think that gives us a pretty good handle on how to navigate inside Fusion 360. We're going to stop it there, and we'll get started drawing. Yay, look forward to that in the next lesson, lesson 1. All right, thank you all.